Actually, very important follow-ups today, specifically in regard to Syria and Israel. More insight on what can now clearly be called a concentration camp. By the very definition of the word, the U.S.-controlled al-Rukban camp in Syria, and how badly Syrians are starving, suffering, and desperately want to leave, and the U.S. won't let them. While they're forcing fake aid on other countries that don't need it, the United Nations is increasingly seeming to stand up to Israel and the United States, both on Israeli war crimes and Trump's illegal proclamation of the Golan Heights. The U.S. is now calling for Syria to pull back from the Golan Heights, which is unbelievable, as the rest of the world acknowledges this move is legal, yet they're now still they want Syria to move back from this area. Showing you that what some people have been saying, that this is basically the prelude to the U.S. actual ground invasion of Syria, they may actually be right. But to begin today, and to almost perfectly align with what I was just saying yesterday, Israel is yet again, unsurprisingly, illegally and unprovoked, attacking civilian populated areas in Syria from U.S.-controlled areas using U.S.-made bombs. First article coming from 21st Century Wire, entitled Breaking: Israel Attacks Aleppo, Helping Terrorist Ground Forces. So it's very interesting development here, especially coming off of all of what we've been seeing. The attacks on Gaza from Israel, the proclamation about the Golan Heights in regard to Syria, how this all ties in. It seems almost unbelievable that they would choose to take this kind of a step now, with all the criticism and all of the commentary going on about all of their crimes and what they're actually doing. And it really, more than anything, shows you how they can do these things with impunity. This is probably the worst political time for them to openly attack Syria, in regard to the world politics. In regard to Netanyahu and his election, this is clearly a positive thing, and that's probably one of the reasons why we're seeing this attack. But politically speaking, for the international community, there couldn't be a worse time for for Israel to step up and carry out another illegal act, another internationally criminal act, another human rights violating act. But they did anyway. And of course, the United States, as usual, is supporting it. Now, in the late hours of March 27th, yesterday, Israeli warplanes carried out several illegal airstrikes on Syrian positions inside Shakur Najar industrial area northeast of the city of Aleppo. Now, the Syrian air defense systems have engaged Israeli missiles over the city of Aleppo and reportedly shooting down, they claim, approximately 12 incoming targets. But as always, it's disputed from one side or the other. Now, the Syrian military said the Israeli airstrike caused damage only to materials in the location, while opposition sources, of course, said the strikes hit Iranian ammunition stores and a military airport used by Tehran's forces. So as always, one side saying, no, this was just an innocuous Syrian location and they're bombing areas where there's civilians within proximity of these bombs. And the other side saying, no, it's Iran. Iran's there, so it's all okay. Even though technically it's not. Still illegal by international law to randomly strike a sovereign nation because a country you don't like is there and they're allowed to be there. As the ongoing excuse that we continue to talk about how they somehow think because Iran's there, it makes it okay. Here's actual footage of the bombing in Syria, which for some reason a lot of these videos are being taken down. I couldn't see them, they wouldn't play, so I actually had to download those myself. But this is just so you can see it for yourself, and all these are in the show notes as usual, the link to the film and the information that we're covering right now. But just so you can see it for yourself. Now, reports suggest that the attack came from the east, which very importantly would suggest that Israel is using U.S. SDF-controlled occupied land in Syria as a launching pad for airstrikes against Syria. A first in this current phase of the conflict. So this is a big deal because not only does that include the United States in the complicity of this illegal act, even though they're also illegally occupying Syria, so I doubt they would even care, but it shows you that this is orchestrated, that they planned this. And that's important. Now, although Aleppo's airports are located on the eastern side of the city's perimeter, by weakening Syria military positions and disrupting its security and air patrol capabilities, Israel's attack, as the article makes a very excellent point of outlining, will in fact benefit multiple terrorist brigades currently positioned around the outskirts of Aleppo. You could ask, was that the intention, or was that a consequence of the act? Was that the whole point of why they're doing this? Logical questions to be asking. As we've already proven in the past, and even Israel themselves have admitted to arming, supporting, and even giving medical treatment to the very terrorists the U.S. pretends to be fighting, and they claim to be fighting as well. But so this has actually benefited largely the terrorist groups positioned around the outskirts of Aleppo, and who have been launching daily attacks into the surrounding neighborhoods. And this greatly helped them. I'm shocked. Now, beyond West Aleppo stretches out to the al-Qaeda-occupied Idlib province, which is also very important, where Western-backed terrorists will also benefit from Israel's attack on Syrian military facilities in and around Aleppo. So all of this directly benefits the terrorist organizations that, specifically in Idlib, that the United States has roundly protected. Now, I might be covering this tomorrow. There's a story that just came out before I went up that was basically accusing Syria of bombing civilian locations in Idlib, even though we have even U.S. documentation and U.S. personnel saying that it is basically a terrorist stronghold. There are civilians there, but it also makes absolutely no sense for Syria to just arbitrarily bomb civilian locations. It makes sense when you're talking about the U.S. and Syria and Saudi Arabia bombing civilian locations in Yemen because they're trying to hurt these people. They're trying to annihilate them. That's clear. But for Syria to do this, and their history has shown the opposite, it doesn't make any sense. So I'll probably touch on that more tomorrow, but I think it's a potential false flag psyop situation where we're seeing a lot of this. But the point is that these are the locations that the U.S. is supporting and helping, and these are where the terrorists are located. Now, as the story develops, or as it has been developing, we also saw that their strikes had caused blackouts. Interestingly, I think the blackout coinciding with Venezuela, I feel like that's a coincidence, but it's hard to ignore the correlation there. But so it also caused massive blackouts, causing suffering for the people in Aleppo. A number of residents of Aleppo City actually told the French press agency that the attack caused a power cut for the entire city. The blast basically caused an electrical blackout in Aleppo. And this is the country's second largest city and a major industrial hub. And this location bore the brunt of years of fighting during the ongoing illegal occupation by Western powers and their allies. Point being, this is an important location for people just trying to live their lives that all suffered and struggled because of these attacks, which happens every time. Now, the claim is made that Aleppo is one of the main areas where Iran's elite Revolutionary Guards have a strong military presence, which is certainly likely, but they're also allowed to be there. This, in and of itself, is used as the justification for this illegal attack, that Iran is simply there. Yet Iran's presence in the area has been supporting local militias that have, in fact, been for years fighting alongside the Syrian army to defeat extremist rebel groups backed by the United States, to defeat the ISIS groups that the U.S. takes credit for defeating, even though they're not defeated. Iran and Syria and Russia have been the ones fighting these groups, and this is so easy to verify. But the point is that they're attacking these groups, even though they're the ones that are fighting the terrorists the U.S. pretends to be fighting. Now, Israel, which considers Iran its biggest threat, even though they haven't attacked anyone in hundreds of years, has repeatedly attacked what they claim are Iranian targets in Syria. And of course, those of allied militia, which makes it incredibly broad, including Lebanon's Hezbollah, which is a legitimate political organization of Lebanon that's supported by the people. Yet, as usual, with no evidence whatsoever to support the claim that Iran is present in these areas. And again, even if true, is still an action that is unequivocally illegal in regard to international law, as Iran was invited by Syria to be in the country. Point of fact, the U.S. and their allies were not. So the only person breaking the law here is the U.S. and Israel. Now, in January, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Israel had carried out an airstrike against what he said were Iranian weapons in Syria. A rare public confirmation of these attacks. And at the time, it was surprising that Netanyahu would admit to these attacks, because usually the narrative is that they strike and they claim, oh, we were attacked first, some wayward rocket. Does that sound familiar? It's the same line they've used in Syria countless times. And then they basically said, yeah, we fired first here. And this is when they kind of stopped with the pretending to be attacked first narrative. They've been attacking Syria unprovoked for a long time. And people used to argue, no, they were some Iran fired at them. And we just, that's all the lies they keep telling. But now they basically admitted this attack was unprovoked and they're not even trying to hide it. They simply say, because Iran is there, we can attack who we want, which is ridiculous. I mean, by the same logic that Israel claims it can attack Syria just because Iran is there, Iran has the legal right to attack Israel anytime it wants to arrest its entrenchment in the Middle East, which is basically exactly what Netanyahu said. He says, we have been taking action with impressive success to arrest Iran's military entrenchment in Syria. So you see the ridiculous nature there. So if that's the same logic, Iran could attack Israel and say the same exact thing, and it's the same exact logic. But of course, it doesn't apply there because Iran bad guy. Now, Israel has said it is crucial to block growing Iranian military influence in Syria and has vowed to push its troops out of the country, despite, having no legal justification or no legal grounds at all to do so. Imagine if Venezuela all of a sudden said it was crucial to block growing U.S.-Israeli influence in Colombia, and vowed to push its troops out of the country and carried out unprovoked attacks on U.S. positions in Colombia. Does anyone have any illusions about what would happen next if this actually happened? Does anyone think that it's any different than what Israel is doing or the U.S. is doing? I'm sure there are some out there that feel that way, but let me assure you, there are exactly the same. The situations are precisely the same, unless you still somehow view Venezuela as just this broad general bad guy with no real justification behind it because U.S. liars say so. Life is not as simple as that. Now, Iran has warned that it will respond if Israel continues attacking targets in Syria, and has repeatedly said its military presence in Syria is at the invitation of the Assad government, because it is, and that it has no immediate plans to withdraw, because it shouldn't and doesn't have to. It's not breaking any laws, it's not attacking anybody, it's helping and actually doing the job the U.S. pretends it's doing. Now, in addition to the Israeli attacks from U.S. positions, it seems that they also used U.S.-made bombs to illegally attack Syria. Now, this coming from South Front, another very important aspect of this whole story, Israeli Air Force uses U.S.-made guided small-diameter bombs in recent attack on Aleppo. Now, this stuff is not even, people are almost desensitized to this. One, because the U.S., as maybe people know because of watching this show, is the world's leading arms dealer, including to over 75% of the world's dictators. Even the mainstream media has confirmed that, but yet they still care about fighting for democracy while they support 75% of the people they pretend they're fighting. That really makes sense. But people are desensitized to this kind of thing when we see the MK-82 bomb in Yemen killing children. It just becomes normalized. Though, the U.S. bombs are everywhere. But it's not okay. And it also shows you the connection between Israel and the United States in all of this and how largely they're out to do the same thing. Now, the Israeli Air Force used U.S.-made GBU-39 small diameter bombs, or SDBs, in this recent attack on the Syrian city of Aleppo. Now, a photo released by the pro-government activists on March 28 reveals the information about these bombs. Now, the photo shows the remains of one of the munitions which were used in the attack that occurred in the late hours of March 27th, as we said. This remains, it appears to be identical to the wing of the GBU-39 bomb. And here's the actual image for you so you can see for yourself. Now, the GBU-39 that was first introduced by Boeing in 2006 is a precision-guided glide bomb with a range of 110 kilometers, which I also find relevant to the discussion, the range. Israel also appears to be using this provocation from U.S. territory, using U.S. bombs, illegally bombing a sovereign nation, and using it all to hype up tensions in the illegally occupied Golan Heights region as well, which has just recently been recognized by the Trump administration as Israeli territory. As always, even though they have no legal justification to do so, they have no legal standing to do so, it's not recognized by international law, but he did it anyway. And it does have meaning, being the most militarily powerful country in the world. As we've seen the United States flout international law on a daily basis and still make things happen to their direction. The point is that they have power to do so, and that makes a difference if Trump does this. But they're using this provocation to hype up problems in this area right after this happens. It all seems tied together. Now, the strike also coincided with an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council that was held at Syria's request over the exact same discussion, the Donald Trump's decision to recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Is it just coincidence this all happened at the same time? I think not. While they were having this meeting about this, they decided to attack Syrian locations and use it to create problems in the Golan Heights. I mean, come on, people. We have to be able to recognize the correlation here. For the next article, U.S. isolated at UN Security Council over the Golan decision. Now, this is something we already kind of touched on, but I want to dive into this article more. But the reality that basically everybody except Israel and the United States, and I can promise you Saudi Arabia. I don't even include their opinion because they're controlled by the other two. But out of those, everybody else has openly stated that they do not agree with this action, that it is illegal, that the world stands against it. Everybody. Even Saudi Arabia made a statement about it, which is funny. I just said that, which I just contradicted myself right there because I forgot that Saudi Arabia themselves had actually spoken out. But Israel, obviously, the same thing, U.S. and Israel will always side with each other. It's funny. I just saw that article randomly the other day, and I thought that was crazy that they did so. But nonetheless, the reality is that everybody else, the most important part being all of the other countries involved in the United Nations, do not agree with the Golan Heights thing, the Golan Heights proclamation. And they did it anyway. And now, right now, there's a bill going through the Senate and the House, which is really weird that I think is, I don't know if that's normal or not, but going simultaneously through the House and the Senate for declaring the Golan Heights Israel's while he already did the proclamation. I mean, that doesn't make sense at all. It shows you that this is a very important aspect for Israel that has a lot of implications for the future. And as some people have pointed out, maybe this means that this is the setup for more ground invasion from the United States, which seems likely based on what we're seeing happen. Now, in regard to this story, the United States was clearly isolated at the United Nations Security Council on yesterday, over Donald Trump's decision to basically give the Golan Heights Israel, give Israel the Golan Heights, which again, he doesn't have the ability to do, but he did it anyway. Now, in a letter requesting Wednesday's meeting, Syria described the U.S. decision as a, quote, flagrant violation of council resolutions, which it very clearly is. While ally North Korea issued a statement backing, quote, the struggle of the Syrian government and people for taking back the occupied Golan Heights. Occupied. Everyone agrees. Illegally occupied. Now, Israel, as for those that don't know, and I've said many times already, they took the Golan Heights from Syria in 1967 during the Six-Day War, and they annexed it in 1981. In a move, the 15-member UN Security Council declared, quote, null and void and without international legal effect. That was when they first annexed it. And still to this moment, everybody agrees with that, apparently except Donald Trump and his little neocon council. Now, British UN Ambassador Karen Pierce told the council that the U.S. decision was in contravention of that 1981 resolution, while Russia's Deputy UN Ambassador Vladimir Sravronkov said Washington had violated UN resolutions and warned it could fuel instability in the Middle East, which I would argue is entirely the point. All of the instability in the Middle East is due to aggressive U.S. and Western foreign policy. Anyone honest with themselves can very clearly see this based off their actions in the past. All of the liberated countries that are completely decimated. It doesn't take much to see the reality. It takes a lot to ignore it, which is what a lot of people do. Aggressively ignore the reality. They bend over backwards to make sure they see it the way they want to, or the way they're told to see it. Now, the European members of the Council, France, Britain, Germany, Belgium, Poland, on Tuesday, also raised concerns about, quote, broader consequences of recognizing illegal annexation and also about the broader regional consequences. Now, clearly, they're talking about other countries doing the same thing, which is already happening. And also the next step, which we all see coming in regard to the West Bank. Annexing territory that's not theirs. Even though they claim it's theirs, it's still in dispute because Israel's illegally occupying all of Palestine. But the reality is this sets a dangerous precedent for people to basically just say, yeah, we'll just sign this piece of paper and this is now ours. I challenge you to challenge me. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But this because of the impunity, the actions that they're taking, knowing they can get away with it. Now, Trump, with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu clearly looking over his shoulder during a visit to Washington on Monday, signed a proclamation, as you all know, as I covered at the time, officially granting recognition of the Golan Heights to Israel, despite all of this. Now, Mike Pompeo said earlier on Wednesday that Washington's decision would help resolve, guess what? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict by removing uncertainty. I mean, he's really suggesting that giving Israel illegally occupied Syrian territory is somehow going to take away uncertainty in regard to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? I mean, these people are reaching. They're probably, I mean, I cannot help but point out repeatedly how weak this propaganda has become. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but I gotta tell you, it's shocking to see. Now, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, also on Tuesday criticized the U.S. decision on the Golan Heights and said the territory was occupied Arab land. And of course, Iran echoed the comments, which clearly they will use to counter Iran's on board, then it's all bad because they're just bad people and everything's bad. I mean, it's the childish narrative they put forward with no evidence to back it up. But again, to reiterate, as if you needed it, everybody disagrees. Just like basically everybody disagreed with the pullout of the nuclear deal, but as the U.S. pressured economically a lot of people to get on his side, they don't agree with these actions. And everybody, including most of even their Middle Eastern allies, are completely against this. And it's important that we recognize this. And it's important that we recognize how all this is taking place. They're illegally attacking Syria, illegally attacking Gaza, illegally taking land, and the U.S. completely backing them, behind the whole thing. And we have to ask ourselves in regard to the whole situation, to what degree do we think this may have been orchestrated, created, discussed, planned in order to help Netanyahu's election, in order to help profiteering for Genie Energy that everybody, including people in the Trump administration himself, are connected to? So many things are tied up in this. So we have to ask ourselves how likely it is that they created the supposed rockets from Gaza, that they created this situation so they could use it for all of these beneficial moves that help nobody in a civilian way, but specifically help these people in the ruling class. How things usually go. Now, another story that completely relates to this that I think is pretty shocking, because this is where it gets into the idea of whether or not this is going to be used to create more conflict between specifically the United States and Syria. As we all know, if you're really paying attention, that they don't want to leave Syria. They don't have any plans to leave Syria. They never had plans to leave Syria, because right now they've got more troops now than they did before they announced they were leaving, before they announced the full withdrawal and the defeat 15 times over the 3 months of ISIS. There's now more troops and more ships and more helicopters and more things on the ground now than there were before. And this has been verified. Vanessa Beeley literally just said this on an interview yesterday after being in Syria recently. And this is the reality. But so now we're seeing this happen from South Front after recognizing Golan Heights as Israel's. U.S. calls on Syrian army to withdraw from separation line. Now this is just the hypocrisy is staggering. I mean, really ridiculous. To tell them to move back as they just gave away their land illegally from a line that Israel's already been violating. I mean, it's just staggering. It really is. That they really think you either just don't know enough about the situation or that you just don't care enough. And both are true for a lot of people. But I truly think a lot of people are beginning to see how transparent this stuff is. This was just on March 27th. The U.S. said that Russia should pressure the Damascus government to withdraw its armed forces from the separation line with the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. And of course, when they don't, then the U.S. is going to draw a red line. Oh, you guys better pull back. We're gonna protect Israel like we promised 1,000 times, regardless of how many crimes they commit and how many laws they break. So we can see how this could develop into something bigger. It says, quote, the United States and this council cannot accept Syria's efforts to establish its presence in the area of separation as the new norm. God forbid they stand in their own territory that's being stolen by Israel. And then the United States speaks out in condemnation because Syria is standing in its own territory. It's ridiculous. This was spoken by U.S. diplomat Rodney Hunter at the UN Security Council meeting, specifically on the Golan Heights. So while the world is standing up and saying what the U.S. did is illegal, we all disagree, everybody sees what it's wrong, they have the nerve to stand up and say, while you're all saying that, yeah, tell Syria to back up because we already took this land. I mean, just think of how brazen that is. This is the way they view themselves. They don't care what the world thinks. They don't care what Americans think. They do what they want. I mean, for crying out loud, the examples are every day. Now, this new demand comes only 3 days after Trump basically handed it over to Israel. Now, the separation line, for those that don't know, between the Israeli-occupied illegally part of the Golan Heights and the Syrian government of Al-Quneitra was the area along the borderline was established under the 1974 Israel-Syria disengagement agreement with the United Nations. This is before the illegal annexation that they said was null and void, to repeat. But so this was basically an effort by the United Nations to stop the conflict, to try to stop them from killing each other. So basically a 1,000 person strong UN disengagement observer force was dispatched to monitor the line, the UNDOF. So these people are along the line, and the idea was to stop the conflict at the moment was they would both back up to a certain area. Even though Syria still maintains that it's their territory and they're illegally occupying it, and so does the United Nations, mind you. They're simply just there as an impartial observer, even though we know that's never the case, in order to stop people from killing each other. So the U.S. wants Syria to adhere to the United Nations disengagement agreement, even while Israel is literally attacking Syria. I mean, think of how ridiculous that is. While they're illegally bombing their territory, they're saying, oh, you better back up from the territory we just stole from you, or we're going to do something. And of course, ignoring the very same agreement that Israel continually ignores this agreement, continually does things into Syria across this line. But yet, no, Syria, you better back up or we're going to sick our dog, the U.S. military, on you. That's basically what's happening. Now, and remember, this is at this council that everybody disagrees with them. They have the nerve to say this stuff. The point is because they record themselves saying this and they post it on Western media and then fail to show you that everybody else disagrees with them. So it seems like they have the agreement. This is how they propagandize you. Now, Hunter's remarks are an example of a typical U.S. hypocrisy action. Classic U.S. hypocrisy. Washington rejects the United Nations Resolution 497, which literally says that the Golan Heights are an illegally occupied Syrian region, and then opposes to Russia-led de-escalation efforts in Syria, but jumps to support any agreement that could benefit Israel. Again, how many times have I pointed this out? How they routinely use the United Nations or even the ICC in the past when it benefits them, when it goes along with what they want, but when it goes against what they're trying to accomplish, no, they don't have to listen to them because we're the moral authority. All the ridiculous things they say, including the United Nations resolutions they continually disregard. Two of which are specifically about the Golan Heights that they don't care about, but then right now are trying to enforce a UN agreement. I mean, this is just comical. These people are cartoons. They, again, do not think you're intelligent enough to do your own research to see this stuff for yourself, because I can promise you the mainstream media will never show you this information, even though it is simple facts. It's not my opinion. It is the facts of the situation, and they will never show you that, which again shows you that they don't care about informing you. They're trying to misinform you. They're trying to change your mind to the way they want you to see things. That's what they do. I mean, do we need more examples from the Russiagate to the Smollett garbage and all the things happening that the media does not do their job? The president of CNN literally admitted, we don't have to investigate things. We just give you what we're handed. It's basically what he said. It's embarrassing, but they're reeling, trying to make themselves not look as ridiculous as they do right now. Now, for the last story of the day, very important in regard to Syria, that I've been covering for a while now. And this is unbelievable how bad this has gotten. And the hypocrisy, again, goes through the roof. While they're literally trying to overthrow a government, claiming because they care about the civilians, even though they're the ones causing all the problems. They're the ones pretending they're forcing in aid when really it's barbed wire and nails and all, and lying, setting their own trucks on fire. All the lies they've been doing. Causing blackouts, hurting the Venezuelan people, pretending they care about them. They're literally starving to death 40,000 people in Syria right now. Now, in my title, I said Al-Rukba on torture, largely because YouTube limits the amount of characters you can use in a title. But I stand by that. This story is not about actual claims of torture, like the United States is carrying out in Yemen with UAE-backed torture prisons we've talked about in the past. But that what they're doing, in my mind, is tantamount to torture. Now, honestly, I wouldn't have even typed torture if I had more room. But the point is that as I put that and was like, that's the word I can fit. I can't fit anything else. I was thinking that is actually 100% correct. You have all of these people here, and you'll see more why as I go through the story, that are literally starving to death, that are literally dying of thirst, that are being raped and extorted by the terrorists the U.S. allows to be in these territories. Willingly allowing that while making sure they're not allowed to leave, even though people are trying to bring them out. That's I can't think of anything that sounds like more like torture than that, other than actual torture. Anyway, I wanted to put that out there because I know somebody somewhere would be like, "There's no torture going on here," but people are dying. So I think that lines up for me on what I would think of torture when you're knowingly allowing this to happen. Now, the United States military has rejected offers to resolve what is clearly a growing humanitarian crisis in the Al-Rukban refugee camp in Syria, which of course sits inside a 55-kilometer zone occupied illegally by the United States along the Syria-Jordan border, which is a very important geostrategic point, which is why they've maintained it, which is why they've promised to basically stay there indefinitely to, combat Iran and protect Israel by their own admission. Even though the original justification they have for being there is to fight ISIS. Even under their own legal justification, which is very thin, the authorization for use of military force, the only reason they're allowed to be in Syria is to fight ISIS, and they literally just claimed it was defeated. So right now they're breaking their own laws. But again, as I just pointed out, they don't care. Now, the U.S. has also refused to let any of the over 40,000 refugees currently struggling in this location, the majority of which are women and children. They're refusing to allow them to leave the camp voluntarily, even though children are dying in droves from lack of food, inadequate shelter, and medical care. Verifiably so. The U.S. has also not provided humanitarian aid to the camp, even though the U.S. military base is located just 20 kilometers away, 12.4 miles. Now think about the absurdity of this. They're not even providing humanitarian assistance to a group of 40,000 plus people that they're forcing to stay there while they're trying to make Venezuelan government look bad for not allowing their fake aid to get in. I mean, these people are unbelievable. It's again, I always say that I feel like you could make a sitcom based off of the ridiculous acts they do. And it's comical. Only because of how transparent and ridiculous what they're doing is. And I really hope that I'm not the only one that can see that. Now, the growing desperation inside this camp, the Al-Rukban camp, has received essentially no media coverage, which is not shocking. Again, likely because it's a U.S.-controlled area. The U.S. controls, so they're not going to talk about it. It's pretty simple. Now, the U.S. has been accused of refusing to let civilians leave the area, which has been independently verified multiple times, talking to people saying they're not allowed to leave, even though nearly every single person in this camp has expressed a desire to either return to Syrian government-held territory or seek refuge in a neighboring country, such as Turkey, because specifically the camp's presence helps to justify the U.S.'s illegal occupation of the area. That is why they're staying there. Just like I said, because they have this location, because they pretend to be protecting these people, even though they're actually killing them, they say that's their justification for being there. Now, though the U.S. has long justified its presence in Al-Tanf as necessary to defeat ISIS, the U.S. government has also acknowledged that Al-Tanf's true strategic importance, of course, lies in containing Iran by blocking a connection from Iran to Syria through Iraq. The phantom land bridge they're always talking about. That is a fallacy. As many journalists have pointed out, how absurd it is to think that they can't, fly a plane or go take another road. It's ridiculous to think this one area somehow is going to stop them. The reason is they want to take this area is to maintain their presence in Syria. That's why. Now, Al-Tanf lies near the area where the borders of Syria, Jordan, and Iraq meet. Thus, in the U.S.'s game of brinkmanship with Iran, Rukban's estimated 40,000 inhabitants have basically become pawns, and their needs are completely ignored by the United States. Now, on Tuesday, delegations from Russia, Syria, and the United Nations and the Rukban refugee camp met to discuss the fate of the camp's inhabitants after a UN survey found that 95% of the camp's inhabitants wanted to leave, while 83% wanted to return to their hometowns in areas of Syria, now under Syrian government control. Now, first of all, how ridiculous, how obvious that contradicts the narrative that every time the U.S. leaves these areas that Assad just can't wait to chemically bomb his people because he's a maniac. Not only is it not accurate, not true, and their own stories are blown up in their faces, but this doesn't make any sense. It literally doesn't make sense as he's about to win that he does something that gives them the justification to come back in. That's ridiculous. But the point is that a UN survey has found that every one of them, 95%, wants to leave and the U.S. won't let them. It's staggering. Now, however, the U.S. military, of course, and the State Department officials in nearby Jordan rejected an invitation to this meeting. A meeting by interested parties, concerned parties, and the United Nations to discuss that these people are suffering, knowing they all want to leave. And the U.S. just said, nah, we don't care. We don't care. We don't acknowledge your authority. Now, the U.S. military also prohibited a Syrian-Russian delegation from entering the camp on Tuesday. Now, the delegation had sought to assess conditions in the camp. Knowing all the things they've been hearing, knowing all the United Nations, the polls they've taken, knowing everyone's suffering and wanting to leave, they wanted to assess the conditions for themselves because it's a Russian ally. And the conditions have become increasingly desperate, according to the reports from a variety of outlets, including U.S. government-funded outlets like the Voice of America. So think about that. Even the U.S.'s own propagandists are saying, yeah, it's pretty bad there. People are dying and suffering and everyone wants to leave. And the UN says the same thing. Russia says the same thing. Syria says the same thing. And the U.S. just says, no, you can't come in. We don't care. The impunity, the fact that they could do this, knowing that it's happening and just move forward, is unbelievable and really has to show you the true nature of these people. And of course, the absurd claim that they care about Venezuelan people, or any people for that matter. Yet, as usual, despite the evidence and the international condemnation, the U.S. has blocked refugees from leaving under claims of U.S. protection because they're protecting them while they starve them to death. Now, the U.S.'s refusal to attend the meeting or allow a delegation passage comes less than a month after the U.S. military blocked the entry of evacuation buses overseen by Russian and Syrian forces that would have allowed the refugees to leave the camp. Again, stopping them from actually taking people that want to leave. Now, an often overlooked problem that has prevented them from leaving is that U.S.-backed and U.S.-trained moderate rebels, in quotes, of course, terrorists, have been known to block camp inhabitants from leaving. The terrorists that we literally just reported that the U.S. made a deal with, holding their families hostage, told them they were going to use them to invade Syrian territory, but for the time being, they were going to shuffle them over into Al-Tanf, reported by a Syrian journalist on the ground in Syria. And other than that, we have countless examples of them doing exactly the same thing, using Al-Tanf as a way to dance back and forth between U.S. and Syrian-controlled territory, using U.S. as a shield. U.S. knowing this. But the point is, these terrorists are in this camp, allowed to be in this camp, and they're the ones making these people suffer. They're blocking the inhabitants from leaving, demanding large payments in U.S. dollars, mind you, to leave the area. Also documented. Now, the U.S. military took control of Al-Tanf alongside these moderate rebels, these terrorist forces, in 2014, after wresting the area from ISIS, apparently. Sure, just like we just reported, I'm sure they wrestled it away from them. These SDF and ISIS and U.S. forces are all intermingled in this effort to kind of exchange territory under the guise of fighting terrorism, when in reality they're all just incrementally trying to take Syria. Now, many of those opposition groups have since been revealed to very clearly have ties and sympathies to terrorist groups, including ISIS. Big surprise. I'm just utterly shocked. And the most pressing problem is the access to food, of course, as starvation has become an extremely large threat for those living in this camp. Last October, it was reported that the Vagabond camp had been without food or essential supplies for months. 40,000 people forced in this camp by U.S., and they won't even give them supplies. Only 2 aid deliveries managed jointly by the Syrian Arab Crescent and the UN were able to enter the camp. So while the U.S. tries to force unnecessary aid trucks full of everything but aid, it can't be bothered to give aid to those forcefully held under its care. I mean, it is just disgusting. Now, the lack of food combined with the lack of medical care has been responsible for scores of deaths in this camp, the majority of which are children under the age of 2, who often die from malnutrition and preventable diseases. Similar to one child every 10 minutes that dies in Yemen, and that's not being talked about either. Big surprise. Now, others have died from freezing weather owing to a lack of adequate shelter, with 8 children dying just in January for that very reason. Now, satellite images, which I've shown in previous shows, taken of this camp in March, show the recent creation of mass graves containing an estimated 300, some said 500 bodies based on the tombstones that you can see. Mass graves. Now, despite the desperate conditions less than 13 miles from a U.S. military base, the United States has declined to send food, doctors, medical supplies, or other forms of aid to the Rukban inhabitants. Of course, while also preventing them from leaving and stopping Syria and Russia from helping them. Now, however, the United States has been providing militant groups, terrorists in the same area where they're holding these people hostage. They're providing these terrorist groups in this area with military and logistical support. Of course, because it's important to help the terrorists that you're using to overthrow our country, but no, we can't help the people we're forcing in this camp. These militant groups not only control the flow of food and aid in the camp, but terrorize its most vulnerable inhabitants, actually forcing women and children into sex slavery, which is also documented, and engaging in human trafficking. Can anybody say they're surprised that sex trafficking is happening in a U.S.-controlled area? I'm not. Now, all of this is taking place in a deconfliction zone controlled by the U.S. military. Now, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said earlier this month that, quote, the fact that people are not allowed to leave the camp and are held hostages makes one suggestion that the U.S. needs this camp to continue justifying its illegitimate presence there, which I think is abundantly clear. And as the article makes the very clear point, by the very definition of the word, this is literally a concentration camp. And the only person that argues otherwise is the United States. We have everybody else around them except their close allies and the United Nations even doing their own investigation and saying very clearly these people are being held against their will. 95% of them want to leave. They're starving, they're dying, they're being raped, they're being sold into sex trafficking. And the U.S. won't allow them to leave and they won't allow anybody else to help them. How is this something that is allowed and okay today? How, if you're an American out there, are you standing here listening to this thinking, yeah, that's a good use of my tax dollars? It's important that people begin to do their research and see these things for themselves because you will never hear about anything like this from the mainstream media. And as always, that has to show you more than ever that they're not here to inform you. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope some of this information woke somebody up out there and will trigger them to get out and spread the information. Will make them want to do their research, want to look deeper into stories they thought they knew all about. Because that's what it's all about, understanding that we never really know anything for sure. That they're always lying, they're always manipulating. So it's important to stand back and with very clear discernment and questioning anything that comes across your path. That's what it is all about.